Hey folks, Nathan here from the Star Wars Timeline Gold, Star Wars Beyond the Films, the Star Wars Reports, Rebels Roundtable, and so on, bringing you another look at some more Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars material. This is the core rulebook, not the beta rulebook. That one is now basically out of circulation here. This is the core rulebook for Age of Rebellion, the second of the 3 planned RPG lines for Fantasy Flight Games as Star Wars RPG. Compatible with Edge of the Empire, but this is a separate game. You don't need the one to play the other, though they are able to interact with each other, as we shall see. Now, hopefully you can bear with a little bit of shaky cam here. I'll let YouTube fix that later. I want to show you quite a bit in this book. It's a big book for the money. I mean, this thing is incredibly fat, and it better be, given that it is $60. You can get it for about $42 on places like Miniature Market, which is where I got mine. Now, unlike the Edge of the Empire core rulebook that now has its little read this first part built in, there's a Boba Fett face at the time. In this case, the stuff that we got with that, with the introduction and whatnot, that's actually built into the front of the book like it is for the later printings of Edge of the Empire. Okay, what you've got here is you have a chapter on playing the game, basically a rundown of how the dice work and things like that. Character creation, we'll go and take a look at that in a moment. We've got a chapter on skills, one on talent, one on gears and equipment, or gear and equipment. A note here about gear and equipment. Most of it in this book is very generic, not a lot of specifics. It's stuff like, here's information about blaster rifles. Examples of types of blaster rifles are, without going into specifics on individual makes and models and things like that, it's much more generic, not a lot of specifics that you get into if you're a big Legends continuity fan looking for more details and so forth. You got a big section here on conflict and combat, because this is the RPG that's basically based on the Imperial versus Rebel conflict, kind of the meat of the classic trilogy era. I think in that case it's going to be a lot more useful to me than Edge of the Empire, because I really like this type of conflict rather than the Fringer stuff. Then you've got a section on starships and vehicles, the Force, but again, that's something we're going to see later in the third of the RPGs, so instead, this is another of these sort of, here's how to work it in if you want to, things like with Edge of the Empire, but not really designed to be used in great detail in this type of campaign. Then you got your chapter on the Game Master, how to run a campaign and so forth. Your Gazetteer type thing here, the Galaxy, gets a chapter. The Rebellion, lots of detail on the organization and history of the Rebellion because it is such a big part of Age of Rebellion, of course. Adversaries, again, mostly generics. And then you have an adventure in here called Perlemian Hall, as opposed to Operation Shell Game, I believe it was, back in the beta. Unlike the beta, of course, lots of great artwork in here, terrifically laid out, and they address very quickly, very early on, a couple of different products. You've got hey, if you're new to role-playing games, check out the beginner game for Age of Rebellion, which I suggested is a very good book. And they quickly address, what about Edge of the Empire? And point out that you don't need it, they are compatible, and they have a whole section, well, a 2-page spread, if you want to call that a section, that goes into how to put these two together. Playing the game, again, goes through all the details about how the dice work, pretty much what you would expect from this type of game. Then you get into, as I'm flipping here, character creation. And in this case, you've got character creation. It's very much like Edge of the Empire. Pretty much all of this is like Edge of the Empire. It's just leaning in a different storytelling type direction, except for some small details here. As far as your options for species, you've got Bothans, droids, Duros, Gran. Then you've also got in there the option of going with a human, an Ithorian, a Mon Calamari, or Mon Cala, perhaps, or a Sullustan. But of course, you can use any of the other species that we got with Edge of the Empire so far. You are not limited to just those. They just happen to be the ones used in this book. And they go through the whole idea of character creation and your specializations. You've got ones that match up basically with the types of characters that we got with the beginner game. You have the Ace. The Ace could be a driver, a gunner, or a pilot. You got the talent trees and everything all set up in here. You got the commander, who could be a commodore, a squadron leader, or a tactician. And notice they've got little bits in here like bios for sample ones. Those are the same bios you find on those folios from the beginner game. It's characters that we've seen before. The diplomat, you have the ambassador, agitator, or quartermaster version of the diplomat here. The engineer you could go with, the mechanic, saboteur, or scientist engineer character. The soldier could be a commando, medic, or sharpshooter. You got the spy, who could be an infiltrator, a scout, or a slicer. A slicer is considered a spy in this case, the way that it's all set up. And then, interestingly, you have this other talent tree that you can use with additional cost that could apply to anybody, which is a rebel recruit, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to play on this, to let you use this and get access to more talents and such without having to necessarily change what your initial plan was as far as what kind of specializations and stuff that you wanted to get into. They talk about experience points, your derived attributes, your motivations in this case include beliefs, connections, and quests, specific quests, and then you get into, of course, your gear. Get some resources to start out with, and you move on to skills. And, of course, the skills, very much like what we got back in our previous game, of course, Edge of the Empire. Just kind of goes on and on and on, your talents and so forth to get into. Great options, but again, it's very much like what we got with Edge of the Empire, because they are compatible. Gear and equipment, again, this is where you get into some very basic, very generic stuff, like, again, blaster carbine. Models include, instead of going into a bunch of very specific terminology here, you get into things like customizing your gear, which I thought was kind of a cool way to do it. Lots of cool customizations. And they go into things like conflict. How are you going to play your conflict out here? How are vehicles going to work in conflict? How are individuals going to work in conflict? Because it's something you're going to see a lot within the span, of course, of any kind of Age of Rebellion game. It's all about, of course, the rebels versus the Empire. Then you got your chapter on the Force. Now, the Force, again, is not something you're going to see typically used within this type of game. You might, but again, that is more for the third of these. Okay, but there are ways that you can use this. There is, you may recall, there is that Force-sensitive exile that you could use as a specialization back in Edge of the Empire. Well, this one introduces the Force-sensitive emergent, which is another one, so you've got the option to do this as well, which I thought was kind of cool. Not only they're giving you a chance to use the Force some if you really want to, but it's done in a different way, slightly. That gives you more options for both of the RPGs, as opposed to it just being a repeat of the same material. You get into stuff here with the Game Master. They talk about setting up the game and all that kind of stuff, how to interpret the dice pool with some examples and whatnot, experience, blah, blah, blah. Just how are you going to set up a game, linear versus non-linear campaigns and whatnot. Your two-page spread there goes into the compatibility with Edge of the Empire here. And in this case, it does say, look, you can use stuff from either. It doesn't matter. They all are all connected together. But there is one significant difference. The significant difference is that when you're creating a character for Edge of the Empire, you set it up with obligation. In Age of Rebellion, you have what's called duty instead. And basically, if you're going to use both games as materials, that's fine, but you've created characters under the rules for one or the other, generally. So you can play the game using either just obligation, just duty, or both, and they tell you how. Or you can set it up to go with either, not something you predetermine. And of course, it does focus on this idea, well, wait a second, what if you've got a specialization? What if you've got a talent or something that shows up in one game and then shows up in the other? Can I maybe specialize in two identical things and get twice as good? No. That's very much like a lot of card games and things like that. If you got two things with the same name, they can't be in play both at the same time. So a specialization under a name from one and a specialization under the same name from the other cannot both be used for the same character. That just wouldn't work. Then you got sort of your Gazetteer. Love the map they've got in here, kind of inspired by the Essential Atlas, I would think. Gets into bits about the different parts of the galaxy, then some individual planets, albeit not many, and then a great section on the history of the Rebellion. Bear in mind, this is all Legends continuity, so yes, stuff like Starkiller from The Force Unleashed is in here. This is not part of that new story group canon. Gets into adversaries, again, very, very generic adversaries, nemesis, minion characters, and so forth. And for me, the thing that always gets me, that I always get excited about is new adventures, because I'm big on getting the story content out of these when I buy them, not playing them as the RPG as much. And they've got Perlimian Hall. Basically, there's this convoy of freighters that are going down the Perlimian trade route, and your job is to get aboard the lead one and take it over because there is some type of cargo aboard that you need for the rebellion. But it's cargo that is left undetermined, so you as the game master can decide what best fits your players, their duty, and their ongoing campaign. I thought that was kind of a nice touch, that it wasn't something previously existing that you're stuck with, as if there's really anything the game master can't change in order to make this whole thing fun. As soon as that is over with, though, book is done, you're into your index, you're into your character sheets and whatnot, and that's pretty much it. Giant book, great art, great quality, and it uses those fun mechanics that Age of the Empire did. I really like the way that the dice mechanics and stuff work for this RPG compared to others. It is pretty steep as far as the price goes. I would say if you were going to go for this or Edge of the Empire, make your choice based on the theme. Would you rather look at someone who's on the fringes, maybe has an obligation to a crime family or something, who's not necessarily part of the Rebel Alliance or the Empire, just trying to get by, a simple man trying to make his way in the universe, as Jango Fett might say? If that's the case, go for Edge of the Empire. You want something that's more Empire versus Rebellion? You want to be a Rebel agent going up against the evil Empire? Choose Age of Rebellion. I think this will be one that's much more combat-oriented, but that just happens to be my particular play style. So, a great book, check it out. The beta is still out there on places like eBay and such, but if you want the real deal, this is it.